the unseen agreements that prevent global collapse. Nothing was signed, no announcement was made, and yet the world did not fall apart. This matters today because the global financial system survives not only on laws and institutions, but on quiet understandings that exist beneath them, agreements that are never published, promises that are never formally recorded, expectations that are never enforced by courts, yet hold the system together when formal structures begin to strain. To understand this, we have to move past the idea that global finance is governed solely by rules. Rules matter, but they are too rigid to handle every crisis. When pressure escalates faster than legislation can respond, something else takes over. A layer of coordination that operates through trust, precedent, and shared self-interest. London became one of the places where these unwritten agreements formed naturally, not because the city controlled outcomes, but because it sat where consequences converged. When institutions realized that failure would not remain isolated, cooperation became rational. Survival required alignment. At first, these understandings were informal. Competitors shared information during stress. Rivals coordinated timing to avoid mutual destruction. Institutions agreed, without speaking, not to exploit moments of weakness that would destabilize everyone. These were not acts of generosity. They were acts of realism, because collapse is rarely profitable. Over time, these patterns hardened into expectation. During crisis, certain behaviors were assumed. Liquidity would be shared within limits. Fire sales would be avoided where possible. Communication would remain open, even between adversaries. These agreements were never written down, because writing them down would weaken them. They relied on memory, on reputation, on the knowledge that betrayal would be remembered. As markets globalized, these understandings expanded across borders. Different legal systems, different cultures, different incentives, yet the same unspoken logic applied. Some actions were understood to be unacceptable, not because they were illegal, but because they were existentially dangerous. This invisible layer is what activates when formal safeguards reach their limits. And when it works, nothing dramatic happens at all, which is why almost no one notices it. These unseen agreements operate in the narrow space between self-interest and collective survival. In calm markets, competition dominates. Institutions push for advantage, exploit inefficiencies, and protect their own positions aggressively. But during stress, priorities shift. The logic changes from winning to enduring. Actions that might be rational in isolation become dangerous in aggregate, and the system senses that shift. London's networks are particularly sensitive to this moment. When pressure rises, communication intensifies quietly. Phone calls replace emails. Conversations become direct. Language becomes cautious. The goal is not coordination in the formal sense, but awareness. Everyone needs to know how far others are willing to go. These agreements are not altruistic. They are conditional. Cooperation exists only within understood limits. Liquidity is shared, but not freely. Exposure is reduced, but not dumped recklessly. Institutions protect themselves, but they avoid actions that would force others into collapse. The balance is delicate and constantly renegotiated. What makes these agreements powerful is mutual vulnerability. Every major participant knows that triggering collapse elsewhere invites retaliation, regulatory backlash, and long-term damage to reputation. The cost of destabilizing the system far outweighs the short-term gain. This shared understanding becomes a restraint stronger than regulation. But this restraint is invisible. There are no signatures, no enforcement mechanisms, no guarantees, only memory. Institutions remember who cooperated and who exploited. They remember who stabilized markets and who accelerated panic. These memories shape future access, trust, and opportunity. In this way, reputation becomes currency, and the threat of exclusion becomes discipline. During global crises, this layer activates instinctively. Institutions adjust behavior without instruction. Markets slow not because rules demand it, but because participants sense the boundary. Activity becomes cautious. Aggression softens. The system breathes. But these agreements are fragile. They depend on shared belief that others will act similarly. If even a few actors violate expectations, trust erodes quickly. Cooperation collapses into suspicion, and once suspicion dominates, the agreements lose their force. That is the risk at the heart of this invisible system. It works only as long as everyone believes it will. And belief, once shaken, is difficult to restore. The conflict emerges when these agreements are tested under extreme pressure. As crises deepen, incentives begin to diverge. What protects one institution may endanger another. What stabilizes today may create exposure tomorrow. The quiet balance between cooperation and self-preservation becomes harder to maintain, and the temptation to break from consensus grows stronger. London has seen this fracture point before. During severe stress, some participants begin questioning whether restraint is still rational. If others are reducing risk aggressively, should they do the same? If liquidity is thinning, should they exit first? The fear of being last becomes more powerful than the fear of collapse. This is when invisible agreements are most vulnerable. A single aggressive move can trigger a cascade. One institution acts decisively to protect itself. Others interpret that action as a signal. Confidence erodes. Cooperation weakens. The system shifts from collective survival to individual defense. Panic accelerates. Inside the city, this moment is recognized instantly. The tone of conversations changes. Silence replaces dialogue. Assumptions are questioned. The risk is no longer market volatility, but behavioral breakdown. Once participants stop believing that restraint is shared, every action becomes defensive. Intervention becomes urgent but delicate. Formal authority can step in, but it is blunt. Regulation moves slowly. Public action signals severity. The invisible agreements are faster, but they rely on belief. Restoring that belief requires demonstration, not instruction. Someone must act in a way that proves cooperation still exists. Often, this role is taken by the largest or most trusted institutions. They absorb losses temporarily. They maintain liquidity longer than strictly rational. They signal continuity through action. These moves are costly in the short term, but they stabilize the system long enough for others to regain confidence. This is not charity. It is leadership under pressure. But leadership carries risk. If cooperation is not reciprocated, those who stabilize become vulnerable. The decision to uphold the agreement becomes a gamble, one based on faith in shared survival. And that gamble defines whether the system bends or breaks. Because when unseen agreements fail, formal rules arrive too late, and collapse becomes visible. The climax arrives when restraint finally proves stronger than fear. At the height of pressure, when incentives pull in opposite directions and trust feels fragile, the system hesitates. Not freezes, hesitates. And in that hesitation, the unseen agreements are tested one last time. Do participants act only for themselves? Or do they protect the structure that protects them all? When the agreement holds, the outcome is subtle but decisive. Aggressive moves slow. Liquidity, though scarce, does not vanish entirely. Communication resumes. The system stops accelerating toward collapse and begins absorbing stress instead. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is the victory. This is how global collapse is prevented, not through speeches or emergency laws, but through collective restraint exercised under extreme pressure. Institutions choose not to exploit weakness. They accept short-term pain to avoid long-term ruin. They remember that survival depends on the system remaining intact. The resolution is not harmony. It is endurance. Losses still occur. Some institutions fail. Markets reprice risk sharply, but the damage remains contained. The system bends without breaking. And once the immediate danger passes, the invisible agreements fade back into background, ready for the next test. This is the paradox of modern finance. The most important safeguards are the least visible. The strongest protections are the least discussed, and the moments that prevent disaster are rarely remembered. London's role in this process is not authority, but continuity. It is a place where memory accumulates, where reputation matters, where restraint is learned through history rather than imposed by rule. The city does not eliminate risk. It manages the behavior surrounding it, because in the end, global finance is not held together by contract alone. It is held together by the shared understanding that some lines must never be crossed, even when crossing them would be profitable. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The